Thank you for joining us today. I'm Andy Rotherham. I'm a partner here at Bellwether and a co-founder. We're very excited about this conversation. We have three fantastic guests, and we're looking forward to your questions as well about what's next for the science of reading as states and districts move from setting these policies to actually implementing them. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Closed captioning is available for this webinar and will be available on replays. If you're having any trouble with that, turn that on using the closed captioning button. It's at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please submit questions to the Q&A button below. That's also at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. And as I mentioned, we're going to be recording the discussion so you can watch it back, share it, watch it later, share with colleagues, all of that. Like I said, three great guests, so I want to leave as much time as we can for the discussion. Let me just quickly set the stage. Last week, Bellwether released an analysis called On the Same Page. It's a guide for leaders, policymakers, advocates. It's a primer on the science of reading, the history, where we are now, and some implementation challenges. There's a QR code on your screen right now. You can click on that or use a code reader, and that will link it right in to the report. We'll also put a link in the chat for you, and it's on our website, easy to find. We encourage you to take time to read it. It's part of a series of reports we do on stock taking, where we present facts and things around various issues. Our last one was on a lot of data around a number of culture war issues. That was called Common Ground. You can check that out as well. There's no shortage of ink spilled on this topic of the science of reading. I mean, there's just articles just over this past weekend. Why do we choose this topic? Why now? First, I think a lot of people may not be fully aware of the long history on reading. Like, often you'll talk to people that are not even aware of Bush era history around reading, let alone before that. And that this really goes back a half century in terms of what's going on. And that's really crucial context, frankly, on this issue in terms of implementing this, but also just as we think about education policy questions, evidence, and so forth more generally. Second, a lot of people's perception is that the science of reading movement is riding high and dominating. And I think that's certainly true. At one level, you can see that nearly every state in the country is making some move. A lot of states are making substantial moves. Virginia, where I'm involved in education policy, we have a new reading law, and we're implementing a lot of things. You hear a lot about Mississippi and so forth. And that's a real credit to a lot of people, including some folks on this call. We've got some people who have led on this nationally and in different states and school districts. We've also, though, at the same time, I think some of us feel like we've seen this movie before with other large-scale reform efforts, and it doesn't always end well. And sometimes promising ideas don't either reach their full potential or even get rolled back. And I'm sure, on this call, there's lots of different views about lots of different questions. But I think the big lesson that comes out is around implementation and thinking about that. How do you engage teachers and so forth? How do you avoid politicalization in a sector that is, I don't need to tell any of you, hyper political? And so that's some of the stuff we're going to look at here. And we're not doom and gloom. We're very excited about what's happening and so forth. But we do think, as we've seen on some other issues, it's worth pausing, having some conversations and so forth, thinking about what are our warning signs, how should leaders address them, what do we need to do in terms of implementation, keep doing, stop doing, course correct, all of that kind of thing. So I really couldn't think of a better group of people to talk about that than who we have here today. Barbara Davidson is president of StandardsWork, and she's the executive director of the Knowledge Matters campaign, which has been doing a lot of work on the role that content knowledge plays here. We're going to talk about that a lot. Penny Schwinn, who just had sort of a legendary run as education commissioner in Tennessee from 2019 to 23, and launched a major early grades literacy initiative that's one of the big models. And Beth Thompson, who any of you who do district work are going to be aware of. She's currently Chief of Strategy and Innovation in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and she's working on these issues. She was previously a principal, so she brings a really valuable perspective. Barbara, I'm going to just start with you. You've worked on this issue from different angles for a long time. When advocates say, let's just start with a real basic one. When advocates talk about the science of reading, What are they seeking to change? What's different now?
Yeah, when I think about the term science of reading, I think about as it's sort of been applied over these past 5 years. And it really does refer to this body of knowledge about how the brain works, and knowledge that has been around for some time, but is really just being made more known to parents and to educators. So really, the sort of current iteration of, and what we sort of know as the science of reading movement, was led by parents that were of children with dyslexia and other reading challenges. Emily Hanford, who's probably name known to most everybody on this call, did some brilliant reporting back in 2018. And she's really, brought public awareness to the fact that reading instruction was bereft of and not benefiting from all that we'd recently learned about how the brain works. Her first piece was Hard Words. It was important, and Sold a Story is the reporting that folks probably know even more so. And what she did is, I think, one of the most important things, and I'll answer your question about what wasn't going right, but what she raised public awareness about is that reading is not a natural process, and that the brain isn't wired to read. And the kids need to be explicitly taught to read, and that means that they need to connect sounds and letters. That sound is the starting point of reading is something that we had completely, lost sight of, if folks really even knew it, and that the kids don't crack that code naturally. Again, they have to be taught. Some kids learn it pretty fast. It comes, quicker for them, but they are still going through that process of making connection of sound to letters. And some need more, much more explicit and prolonged sort of practice and instruction. So, what happened as educators, one of the important things that Emily did, I think, is in her reporting, is to interview educators who said, yeah, I wasn't taught that way. And so they were a big part of, of the story, and have been a big part of this movement. What she exposed was, and what educators helped to, sort of give voice to, is the fact that the dominant way in which kids were learning to read was there was an awful lot of guessing and reliance on context clues, including pictures on the page. So truly, if a child came upon a word that they didn't know, you would encourage them to look at the picture and sort of guess from there. And then, of course, skipping words that you don't know, and maybe you'll figure it out, as you sort of read on. 3Qing, which I'm going to be honest with you, I taught learning disabled children and was pretty well trained back in the mid to late 70s. I had never heard of 3Qing until Emily Hanford named it. Apparently I'm in good company with Marilyn Adams and some other folks that hadn't either, but she taught us that this 3Qing system and so forth, that really did rely on just all of these graphics cues and semantics cues, like what makes sense there. If you don't know, if you can't read the word, well, what do you think it might be based upon, what has been said and so forth. As I said, she also exposed the fact that teachers weren't taught this reading science in the preparation program. So a big part of the science of reading movement has been this no shame zone for teachers to say, yeah, I didn't know it. And I certainly hope Penny will talk about what has been happening in Tennessee in that regard, to make so this really is a movement that is as much led by parents and educators as anything else. Another aspect of the science of reading movement is the concern about how reading comprehension happens. So for, a variety of reasons over the past 20, 30 years, reading comprehension got understood as a set of strategies, so and there's definitely science about, the benefits of thinking about what you're reading teaching strategies got way, way out of hand. So much so that, you could argue that students grew up thinking that the purpose of reading was to find the main idea, or to do this thing called compare and contrast, or to do this thing called inference. So what science tells us is that meaning making is heavily influenced by what one brings to the reading experience. So the ability to connect vocabulary words to things that we already know, the depth of background knowledge that we possess, on a subject. So there's a part of the science of reading movement that is very concerned about how content knowledge gets built as well. There's a whole lot more to be said about that. But I just want to make the point that the science of reading movement, which is most often associated with these very, very vital skills, these foundational skills, phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, decoding, and so forth. An equally important part is the meaning making of the words that we read on the page. So with that, I'll stop.
That's great. I think that second piece of like how it interacts with conversations is really important. Penny, like Barbara sort of teed you up there. Talk about like these implementation challenges. How do you translate something like a change in state law around this into actual shift in instruction in classrooms, like from the state level in that role? Like, how do you think about that? How did you approach it in Tennessee, and what did you learn?
Yeah, so I think a big fan of everyone on this call and what they've done, and have certainly helped Tennessee move as quickly as we have. So I think that one of the things that has been most important is we acknowledge the three-legged stool of change. And so you have the policy, you have funding, and you have implementation. And too often with big reforms like these or big changes, there's a focus on one of those three things. You throw money at a problem, or you pass a bill and then assume it's all going to be fine, or it's you're trying to implement without the resources or accountability to do so. And so I think in Tennessee, the thoughtful approach that was taken across multiple stakeholder groups included initial policy with our Literacy Success Act right at the beginning of kind of that first year in COVID. And then moving into what are the ways in which we're going to fund, used a bunch of our ESSER relief dollars, even though they were one time, for sustainable work, which was literacy improvement and improvement in ELA. And then the implementation piece. The other way that we looked at that was kind of the vertical and horizontal articulation of this work. And so it couldn't just be a handoff from elected officials to the state and then we hand it off to districts. We really had to map out the entire delivery chain from state chief to student in a classroom and make sure that we understood every single person who's going to be part of that delivery chain, what they would need to know and be able to do, what that change management looks like for them, and then the quality of expectations they should frankly have of the state in terms of the product or resources or professional development that we were providing. So we mapped that out very, very clearly. And then we did the same thing across the horizontal. So different types of teachers, different grade levels, family organizations, et cetera. And that took, I think, a very different approach. It's why we called it Reading 360. We said, we're not going to play whack-a-mole and try to address just phonics or just high quality instructional materials or just ed prep programs. We said, if we're actually serious about moving the needle in a permanent way, we have to address all of the folks and all of the organizations who are approaching and or tackling literacy in the state. And that's what I mean by that vertical and horizontal articulation. So that was kind of the second piece. And then the third piece was just kind of, it was the getting people on board and getting everyone excited about it. And change is really hard. Like Barbara, I also taught literacy and reading in a way that I certainly would not do now, and had to make that shift. And there is a real emotional component to this where teachers especially are so committed to what happens with students. I've never met a teacher who doesn't want to do absolutely their best work for kids. If that's the case and you haven't been doing it in the way that was going to be the most successful or effective, that's really, really hard from just kind of your own legacy as an educator. And so what we talked about, and there's a woman in Tennessee, Karen, who talks about know better, do better. That became a lot of what we talked about. We worked with external partners related to social media strategies where we had teachers speaking to other teachers. So it wasn't the state commissioner, it wasn't a legislator or even a superintendent. It was the gal or the guy next door to me in a classroom who said, this is what I used to do, this is what I'm doing now, and this is why it's been so good for my students. That kind of marketing campaign, it really is marketing because it's sharing information, it's getting people to understand the big what. It is a little bit of the bandwagon. But the bandwagon we're all trying to join is higher student outcomes. It's not any kind of let's just sell this new innovative way to teach reading. This is what works. This is what will get results for kids. And ultimately, what I found in Tennessee, which I found true every single day that I was commissioner there, is that people want to do what works for kids. They want to do what's best for kids. Everybody across the board wanted that. And so the last thing I'll kind of say outside of this more comprehensive picture in our approach was just the way in which we had districts own and take that ownership and agency over that implementation. I think too often what I see is that it's either way too top down and directive from the state level, or it is so grassroots and localized that you actually don't have that common best practice across the board. So we had very clear roles and responsibilities in Tennessee, where the state was a big funding mechanism. We had a lot of here's the rules of the sandbox in terms of what you could and could not do and what best practice was or wasn't, a lot of the accountability and a lot of the supports and resources. But districts actually created their own consortiums within their regions to determine how they were going to have the entry points into conversations in classrooms with high quality materials. Districts had that ownership in terms of who their external provider was going to be to help with classroom walkthroughs and implementation, who was going to support teachers. And then similarly, districts had opportunities related to the professional development. Every teacher in Tennessee had to participate within 2.5 years around literacy, instruction, training, and professional development, so that we were all teaching reading in the right way. And that extends to our ed prep providers. They are now required to teach reading in the way that learners are going to best learn to read. And that was a big shift, but we had those ed preps actually develop the content and courses themselves, and then we were the review mechanism. So I think, again, it's when people own their own outcomes and their own destiny, as long as you're trying to get to the same place, that is incredibly important for buy-in, making sure you're talking to your peers and not having someone who doesn't know your job talking to you. But the bar for quality was the absolute most important thing that we did. And the thing I would say outside of student outcomes that I'm most proud of in Tennessee is that 97 to 98% of educators who participated in the professional development said that it was a good use of their time, changed their practice, and they were highly satisfied. That's a unicorn of a percent with teachers. Educators are a hard audience. And so you are lucky if you get 70 to 80% satisfaction rates. The fact that we were consistently 97 to 98% elementary and middle school teachers was something that I think has got to be a minimum expectations for state agencies. Do not give teachers low-level products. Do not give teachers low-level PD. They deserve better because they are professionals and should be treated as such. And so I know that was a lot of different content, but again, it's that policy, funding, and implementation, high quality, every single stakeholder, and then making sure you understand how they will have ownership and agency over the work that's moved forward, and cheer and celebrate the heck out of it, because people deserve to know that, yep, we're doing a good job, we're doing a good job. And it's why Tennessee is now at the highest performance level for ELA and literacy than we've ever been since redoing the standards, and are well beyond where we were before COVID. And that's a testament to the great work of our public school districts there.
Beth, I just want to stay on with the same question on you, but from that district perspective, because districts end up doing a lot of the actual change management implementation on something like this. Like, talk about how you've approached that in CMS, what's worked, what's been challenging, and what do you need?
Sure. Well, we did take a lot of that implementation science, and it was supported heavily by the state of North Carolina. And then within our district, we really looked at 3 key questions. How are we going to measure whether we're doing it? How are we going to measure whether we're doing it well? And how are we going to measure whether it's working? And in essence, saying we're setting the standard and we're going to monitor the standard, recognizing that that really enacting the standard starts with doing it in the first place. And so we were able to also align a lot of that work with the work that our Board of Education was doing at the time around student outcomes focused governance. We continue that work. And so a lot of the strategies, including use of the curriculum to make sure that what we were doing was standards aligned and meeting the needs of students, were outlined as district strategies attached to the way that our Board of Education was monitoring the way that we were hitting our goal. So there was the opportunity to be able to align those 2 systems. We did use a lot of core action walkthrough tools to be able to then go into classrooms, first looking like, do we just have the books out of the boxes, right? But then being able to say, we're going to move really quickly from fidelity onto integrity to make sure that we counter this idea that it's one size fits all, and instead say it's one standard for all. And what we want to do is make sure that we are teaching those standards. We're providing you with tools to do that. And we're going to come and look at what that looks like for individual student groups. A couple other things that I think really worked for us is that there were places in which our teachers really early on said, it would be a lot easier if we had blank. One of the areas where they were having to go into files to find some of the lessons related to reading foundational skills. They said, if we could just have like these little tabletop books and they just sat right on the table, then when we're working with a small group, it would be so much easier. So you know what? We provided tabletop books, right? An easy thing to do, and it made life so much easier for teachers. We also looked really quickly and hard at our intervention systems, the way we're provisioning resources and aligning resources to our curriculum related to supplemental and intensive intervention. We watched carefully what was happening in Tennessee around that work, and recognizing that we could actually be putting students at a disadvantage if the way that we're providing supplemental and intensive support to students is counter to the way they're being taught with core. And we have attended to, but continue to work through what it looks like to attend to language acquisition needs in varying areas of the spectrum of student need related to our curricular resources.
How much of that work that you just described has been supported by COVID relief funds, ESSER and so forth? And do you have any concerns about sort of sustainability of these reforms when that money runs out?
We did support a good amount of this using our additional funding, specifically in the area of professional development. However, I'll say that we tried as hard as we could to do so with intentionality, both leveraging funds from the state that were also supporting efforts in implementation, and then also seeking to use funds to build sustainability. So for example, as we were launching really broad scale professional development district-wide that went direct to teacher, we also leveraged funding to be able to train in-house a cohort of our specialists, so that long-term we could continue to provide this professional development as a part of our onboarding efforts for teachers. And so in our brains, that's a way to use the funding to be able to make sure that we have an in-house solution that's more sustainable financially, even after we know we won't have as much funding moving forward.
Fantastic. And what's staying with you for a sec, but what do you see? Like, I mean, we all know it's a truism, but it is true. Badly implemented reforms tend to lead to frustration and backlash. Like, what do you see from your perch? What risks do you see on science of reading, and where do you see things that policymakers or advocates need to attend to keep people on board?
I can tell you some of the things that we've been working on, even just recently. As referenced, I love page 13 of the On the Same Page report that you guys just released, because it really points to the fact that there are multiple parts, there are multiple aspects to learning to read. And specifically, we're really working hard with our board, with our community, with our stakeholders to be able to help people understand that the reading foundational skills component that we spend a lot of time looking at in the K2 world is only one aspect, and our curriculum attends to more than that. However, it's one aspect, and the way we may measure student mastery in K2 may not completely tell the story of what we're going to be measuring when it comes time for an end of grade test in grades 3 and beyond. So in essence, being able to look at different assessments that may be required by our state or required by other entities, and be able to tell the full story of what that tells us about what a student knows and is able to do to help there not be frustration or misinterpreted stories about what students, the transfer of knowledge across grade levels and what we're preparing students to be able to do. I don't want one assessment. I don't want people to look at one assessment and say, well, you did all this in K2, but then we don't see those same numbers in grades 3, 4, or 5 yet, especially when those assessments require really different things. The other thing I'd point to that's just an area of risk for us right now is clearly recruitment and retention of teachers. We're seeking to really work hard with our teacher prep programs for alignment. And we're also really grappling right at this minute, like right in the middle of budget season, with what it looks like to sufficiently onboard teachers. And so we're kind of looking at like, we think maybe 5 work days in August isn't enough. And if we know that teachers are coming in through alternative pathways, what it looks like to own our own and be able to start an onboarding process that's a little more robust, but we believe has the potential to be able to contribute really substantially to retention. Said differently, if we help people make sure they have the skills and competencies to get focused and successful faster in the school year, we believe that will contribute to stronger retention of teachers long term.
I feel like maybe, I don't know, who all is the audience today, but I feel like we may have skipped over something, and that is we're making an assumption about the presence of high quality instructional materials. And you had asked me a question sort of, to think about in preparatory comments, and I didn't include them yet, but you had asked about the interaction between this larger conversation about the science of reading and the curriculum improvement and sort of reform initiative. And I guess in reflecting on that, Andy, I found myself as bullish as I am, and as much a part of championing this science of reading movement as I am. I want to maybe say that the movement toward adoption of high quality instructional materials is almost as important, because none of this really can happen without that. Now, some people call it HQIM. I'm a little more comfortable with the term curriculum, but this movement of, rather than expecting teachers to develop 180 days of lesson plans based upon now this growing understanding of the science of reading and their state standards and many other things, that and a whole body of learning science about retrieval practice and so many other things that are baked into great curriculum that a single teacher, in his or her classroom should not be expected to have to do. And when we get to the end of the conversation, you ask about things that I'm hopeful about. This is one of the things that I am most hopeful about, is because teachers are now being supported by curriculum, maybe some of it better than others, and there are ones that I like more than than some others too, but that are comprehensive, that are core, that all kids are having access to, and that the district is united in the ways that Beth was just talking about, and certainly as is Tennessee is a living, breathing example of it. And it might be interesting to have Penny talk about that. It began with the curriculum, and then you have these many other things that you can do. It makes it I think, and because I'm such a curriculum nerd in many ways and so bullish on it, I think it's a recruiting strategy. I think it helps to keep good people in the profession, because you're not asking teachers to do the impossible thing and suffer for 10 hours over the kitchen table on Sunday mornings or all day Sunday. It was in Tennessee, Penny, where a teacher said, I said, well, how many hours a week are you spending writing curriculum? And she said, oh, honey, after I get home from church on Sunday, I'm doing it, I'm doing it all day long. So this movement, a big part of why the science of reading movement will be successful, if indeed it is because there is curriculum now that is capitalizing on it, learning from it, and teachers are being well supported with good professional learning and the resources that ESSER dollars have provided in getting ever better at not creating curriculum, but becoming masters of in delivering it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And Penny, if you want, I'd love to hear you talk about that. And particularly, like, it seems to me, one of the risks, the implementation risks here actually is that without good curriculum, teachers are going to get frustrated. It's going to seem deadening. It's going to be skills based, as we talked about earlier, and that will spark a backlash and allow some other practices to sort of come back in, because there'll be an intuitive appeal there. And so that the sort of curriculum piece is essential to make sure that this is actually a really enriching experience. So Penny, talk about that. And then I also just want to talk about, like, how do you sort of deal with bad practice? There seems to be a couple of different approaches out there and so forth. But I would love to hear both you and Beth just sort of riff on Barbara's point on sort of curriculum materials and so forth. Beth, you're doing it on the implementation side. Penny, you are as well, but then also a little bit, there's a political side to this. Like, this has been a challenging time there's some really fantastic materials that are nonetheless coming under political pressure, and we should talk about that.
Couple of big topics there. Live and breathe through all of them. So, a couple of things. I think one on HQIM and this conversation around implementation and the future of science of reading, I would say it still goes back to that three-legged stool, but on the opposite side. So one is on the policy side, people can get overly excited, and then you overly legislate, create too many policies, create too many restrictions, and the bureaucracy of it actually loses the entire purpose and intent of what we're trying to do. And you start to see that creep in as when people are looking to make improvements on implementation. Sometimes it reverts back to, well, we should pass a law about it, we should do a policy about it, as opposed to really focusing on how do we get quality implementation? Very candidly, that's a trust issue. That is I don't believe this system over here is going to do what I want them to do in the way that I want them to do it, or they aren't doing it in the way that they should be doing it. Whatever that is when you get too heavy on the statute language or on the policy language, you really take away from the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish. And so I think that is a risk where we just start to see it kind of building on itself, as opposed to just focusing on what are the outcomes. If we're not getting the outcomes we want, then how do we improve the practice or the training, et cetera. From a funding perspective, I think that's real. A lot of folks use those ESSER dollars or one-time relief dollars. Tennessee did as well. But I think the way in which those dollars were invested was critical. And so, like I said, the one-time funds being used in recurring formats was really important for us. So it was building materials and resources that could be used in perpetuity, or gave us some of those initial investment funds to then build something that we reallocated funding towards. On the district side, obviously this is not what every state can do, but we also redid our funding formula. That helped quite a bit. We had a 20% increase in state funds towards public education in the state, but a lot of those funds really were with the intent of including and continuing literacy work as well as high dosage tutoring. And so that was, I think, something that was very unique to Tennessee. It's essentially what we put into the funding formula is the exact same average per year as districts were getting in ESSER. It didn't appropriate the total dollars that the state was spending. So it was a very significant investment that the Governor and General Assembly made into education. On the implementation side, though, I think the number one worst thing that can happen is actually bad practice, because then you're essentially proving that it doesn't work. And so, I mean, I hate to say it, but folks in positions, whether that is a principal, a co-teacher, the commissioner of education, a legislator, whoever it is, you really have to be bullish on implementation, because it hurts everyone else when you see states or districts that are implementing something as critical as this poorly, or when you don't have those massive proof points that are not, you don't want the exceptional, well, they have this much funding and this group of students or whatever excuse making happens. You actually need your traditional normal quote unquote school district to implement really, really well and knock it out of the park, to say everyone can and everyone should, and create a little bit of that cool kids club. I'm going to call out a couple of those in Tennessee. We have so many, and I think that's the beauty and wealth of Tennessee, is that I could really pick any district and feel very good about it. But one that comes to mind is Trousdale. It's a small rural district about an hour outside of Nashville. And they were one of the leads in terms of using science of reading, high quality instructional materials, and implementing with fidelity. And as a result, got really strong outcomes. Lenore City is another one, a small municipal in East Tennessee, incredible outcomes, but their implementation across different learner types was strong. And what they did is set a standard for all of the other similar districts to say, this is what's possible in this timeline. But if districts are not doing it well, if schools are not implementing well, and there are a lot of reasons, poor professional development, not having the materials and resources, not enough time, and the majority of our teachers were spending 10 to 20 hours a week minimum on instructional materials, which is why HQIM is so important. But if it's not happening well, then what you have to have is some kind of carrot and stick. It can't just be accountability, and it can't just be incentives, but there has to be something that pushes people forward. In Tennessee, we really love outcomes and growth. And so from the educator's perspective, and so our educators said, push on the growth and how much we're growing, but give us something on the other side. So we did Best for All. People got banners. We have additional funding and grants that went out, did highlights We did that with the political kind of legislators and folks within the communities. So that way, if I'm doing a press release on XYZ district, their elected officials are quoted in that press release. Their superintendent is in the local publication. You have a flag outside and a banner. So everyone is sharing in those celebratory moments and you're celebrating small wins, but all of that has to be part of it. But the biggest thing that I'll say, and I put some resources in the chat, the number one thing is you cannot let poor implementation go unaddressed or unnoticed just because it's awkward and uncomfortable to talk about, because it actually has a domino effect on all of the other systems and all of the other students. And then from my perspective, lots of other states are not going to be willing to put the pressure on or put their pedal on the gas or their foot on the gas if they see that it's not working in different places. And if it's just Tennessee and just Mississippi, then it looks like, well, that was a special time for them, as opposed to this is actually something we can do as a country and should be doubling down on, not kind of backing away from just because you get pressure.
Let's get down to a little bit of specifics on this, just because it's an illustrative example. There's states that are banning 3Qing. It's bad practice. There's other states that are trying to implement the science of reading without doing that and bringing teachers along. That's a technical question, but obviously with some sort of broader theory of change implications attached to it. Like Beth, how do you think about that? Penny and Barbara, like should we just be banning things that we know are bad practice, or should we be just trying to move the field so those things become sort of artifacts of the past?
Well, I'll say that because we are farther along in the journey, it kind of, North Carolina was a couple years behind us in terms of starting the movement toward use of high quality materials. And so we kind of felt like once all of it started at the state level, we were a little ahead of the game. And so whether it's being banned or not banned, I mean, I can't speak to that necessarily. I can just say that we already had the momentum moving. And so we were able to say, hey, we wouldn't go back now, not even if a pandemic can't hold us back with implementation, then we certainly wouldn't go back. And we saw results really quickly, especially with our younger students. So I wouldn't say that is moving or not moving us. We're moving forward anyway.
I don't know, Andy. I mean, I'm less interested in naming what's wrong and then in helping people to understand what is right to do. So calling out, I think it's incumbent on those in policy positions to you know, it's sort of easy to throw a target at 3Qing and instead I'd have them spending some time really understanding, you know, what we want. I obviously, from the position of leading the Knowledge Matters campaign, am concerned about the extent to which the important role that vocabulary and background knowledge, content knowledge plays. And that's a much bigger issue than really even just literacy, because we're sort of been ignoring science and history and social studies and so forth. And we've got to start carving more time out of the elementary school day to teach those subjects. Maybe it could come in time from a little bit of that ELA time if that were, if we had high quality materials in science and social studies. But I think what I'm a little bit concerned about in some of these the legislative language, you know, that I've seen is, yeah, target, you know, just sort of a banning of something called 3Qing. I would much rather those legislators and those policymakers understand, you know, what it is that we want to have. And to the extent that phonics and phonemic awareness and fluency and so forth are listed is good. But and to this conversation that we're having about the all important matter of the systems that are in place to support professional learning and really advancing the field's understanding of this science, that, you know, what would legislation look like that would do that, as opposed to just sort of taking a shot at one of many, you know, bad strategies.
I'm just going to probably just double down on a little bit of that and say that, you know, I think whether or not you list banning 3Qing in legislation, I've seen a lot of states do that. I think it sets a very clear expectation around you cannot do this. And so from that perspective, I think that I'm supportive of that, to say, like, this is bad practice. You cannot do these things because it is at the root of what has been one of the big problems. But I think to Barbara's point, what is significantly more important is the list of what you should do. And what I find is that sometimes when you just say the list of things that you can't, or here are the requirements of what you need to do, it becomes a checkbox activity. With a lot of statutes and a lot of pieces of legislation, it is, did my kids get X number of minutes of PE? And you check the box. You actually don't know whether the physical education is doing the thing that the legislation was intending to accomplish.
Right.
And I think sometimes eliminating 3Qing has the same effect, where it's like, yep, see, we didn't do that. But there's nothing that really in depth and at a high quality level shows what that should be replaced with. So Tennessee does not have the eliminating of 3Qing. We thought about putting it back in. We had actually just made so much progress and had made so many strides on outcomes without that language. To my point earlier, it didn't make sense to add in more language and bureaucracy for something where we were seeing the movement and not seeing the kind of negative effects that we had anticipated could have been true. And that's a testament to our teachers in the state.
All right, that's great. And staying on this theme of things we should do, let's talk about teacher prep, which seems like something we should do at some point. What's the role there? I mean, NCTQ has done really great work, kind of calling attention to like how much the science of reading is embedded in what teacher prep programs are teaching. There's still, I mean, that's a good news, bad news story. Good news is there's been real progress. Bad news is like we still have a long way to go. A lot of programs still aren't doing it. So talk about that. What's the role that you all see here for teacher prep in these in helping with the actual training of teachers, shifting to this for the understanding of knowledge-rich curricula, and so forth. What do you all want to see from teacher prep, and what are some bright spots?
I'm going to guess that Beth and Penny are better qualified to talk about that from their vantage points. But one of the things I would like to have put on the table is not just the coursework that candidates are engaged in, but what their student teaching experience looks like as well. And maybe Penny could reflect on this. I mean, we certainly hear a number of stories of kids even that are candidates that have gotten maybe even somewhat decent in terms of the science of reading instruction in the pre-service program, and then they get into districts where there's or they're put in their student teaching into districts that aren't using curriculum, that have not yet bought into this sort of mantra about core comprehensive curriculum, and there a lot of teacher prep time in teacher prep is still spent learning how to write lesson plans, when in fact if you're using a good curriculum, what you're doing is doing the intellectual preparation and many of the things that are being discussed in the chat to deliver that curriculum. Instead, you're spending your time writing lesson plans that are unlikely to be used when you get into a district using a good curriculum. Anyway, interested in Penny's perspective in particular here.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things on this. I think first, one of the things that we did that I think was a good idea in theory and then became a really great idea once the university took it and ran and did more with it than I had anticipated. But it's this idea of, we actually created a third-party independent literacy center, reading research center with the University of Tennessee. Again, bringing in someone to take that leadership over peers and with peers around standard setting, what is good, what should be done, what are practices that can change. I'm going to get to a coherence question that came a little bit earlier, but I think having that University of Tennessee partnership allowed for there to be the higher ed leadership and ed prep leadership to then talk to peers around what that change management looked like. Second, though, is just this idea of how do you allow for universities to have the same access as our pre-K-12s? What we heard from a lot of our ed prep programs was they didn't actually have the content. They were not purchasers of the high quality instructional materials. They couldn't get kind of our big three in the state were CKLA, Wit and Wisdom, and EL. That's what over 95% of our districts use. And so if they were going to use 1, 2, or 3 curricula because they knew the teachers that they were training up were going to matriculate to districts that used curriculum A, B, or C, they actually just didn't have it. And so one of the things that we looked to solve for was making sure that our ed preps actually had access to the materials and they could train teachers and support teachers that way. The third thing that I'll just talk about is on that teacher prep and training. The biggest piece of feedback we got in the first kind of 1 to 1.5 years was the one-time training was great. And I think it works for some people, but educators, especially new educators, and frankly, those changing their practice, and that's just as hard, is that getting all of the information in the summer and then trying to retain it and then implement it over the course of an entire school year is really difficult. And so while we saw a lot of folks who really love the letters training, and that is a great model for some people, for other people, they said, I actually need micro bits or micro sections of content throughout the entire year. So if this is what I'm going to be teaching my students, I really need to have those short burst reminders, whether that's daily or weekly. And so for our new teachers, being able to have some access to those resources is really important. It's why we put a bunch of videos up on our website at the department. You can look at someone actually teaching that content in real time and not have to remember what you were taught, 6 or 7 months ago over summer PD. And then just on the coherence question, because that's come up in the chat a couple of times, I think from a state perspective, if there are state or policymakers out there, and even from a district perspective, these cannot be siloed approaches. So if you are going to have a literacy and high quality instructional material nowhere near where we should be anywhere, then you also have to make sure that when you're doing priorities around teacher development and ed prep, that you're actually enforcing and really reinforcing all of those same literacy strategies, like what we did with our teacher apprenticeship program or student tutoring. All of the tutors should be trained in high quality instructional materials and strong literacy practices, because we know that's what works, and they should be doing in the tutoring programs, et cetera, et cetera. So you should have that alignment and coherence across the board. So no matter, again, who that user is, they have the same level of education and access to resources and materials, so that the student experience is consistent across any engagement at any level or grade, whether that is a kindergartner or a middle or high school student, who we expanded our literacy work to include all students within the state, because literacy was something that we saw our older kids struggle with. And our upper grade teachers actually had a much harder time because they did not have the background knowledge to be able to do that work with their kids. So we expanded it in that way. And perhaps are a major part of that. And I think bringing them in on the front end as peers with each other was the best practice that we had there.
So Beth, Penny sort of anticipated, there's a question in the Q&A on this. It was something I wanted to ask about as well. The high school level, and you're seeing really alarming levels of high school kids who are not reading at grade level. That's become worse after the pandemic with all the learning loss. So I was hoping you would talk about teacher prep, and then also specifically, what are we doing about adolescent literacy?
Sure. I think related to teacher prep, we've started our own educator prep program in the state of North Carolina. You can meet certain criteria and do that. So when I talk about owning what we can own, it is been a significant way for our district to build a pipeline for people who are either seeking to enter teaching through an alternate pathway. It's also proven to be a really interesting pipeline for folks who are serving in teacher assistant roles or in tutor roles, who are interested in becoming teachers, but for whom getting that licensure has been a little bit of a barrier. And not surprisingly, if it's our educator prep program, then we're going to instruct people with the resources that we are using in our district. And so really, I know that's not possible for all programs, but if it's our program, then it's absolutely 100% possible. So our literacy specialists are teaching part of the course to be able to build understanding, and we're using the materials that we have right here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. Related to upper grades and adolescent literacy, it's certainly something that we're continuing to look at how we best attend to. We have adopted and are using high quality instructional materials in the area of English language arts, now kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So I think that would be, to Barbara's earlier point, that would be thing one, right? Is that we have committed not just to doing curricular materials that we're all using in one grade level or in a span or K3, but we've gone K-12, and we've really done that both in literacy, and we'll also have done that K-12 in math as well within the next 2 years. And so I think that's a significant commitment and investment to long-term what it looks like to be able to attend to the literacy needs of the students in the district.
So we're coming up on time. Macro question I think is important to the political sustainability here. Like, why now? Is this just like a hero's tale about Emily Hanford, or like what has changed? Like I said, like people have been talking about this for a half century, why Johnny can't read. There's been, there's a lot of history. There's initiatives that were very successful, but were sort of more pushed to the side. So like Barbara, I've been watching from across the river. It seems like Maryland's making some progress on this, following behind Virginia, as is often the case. Like what sort of what precipitated that? What's the like? Why now, and what risk does that point up? Because things that come along really fast can also go away really fast.
Oh, it's interesting. The Maryland Reads organization, new nonprofit that's getting organized to champion many of these interests and this cause in Maryland, I think really was founded again by some of these parents who saw that their kids who had reading challenges were being taught according to methods that were unsound. I guess, Andy, I reflected on that question. I think, and Penny mentioned this earlier, certainly it's a combination of the pandemic opening up people's eyes. Emily's reporting came right, sort of a year before. It was just getting ahead of steam when the parents were stuck at home with their kids and opened up their Zoom screens and said, "Oh my God, what is going on here?" And it just didn't make any sense to them at all. So they and many of them took the bull by the horns and sort of taught themselves what they needed to do. I think the fact that there has been this, and philanthropy gets some credit for sort of helping to advance this HQIM movement. So there have been alternatives. There have been solutions to this problem, that was identified. But I think in many ways, certainly our concern about equity in schools, and we've not talked a lot about that, but that's what's at stake here. That's why all of us are here doing this. That's why we're such believers in the power of great curriculum, because it is an equity play, and so that's going is at play here too. And I think social media, sort of the democratization of literacy, if you will. I mean, the fact that folks really can do something about it, and make some noise and object. So I do think it's different this time.
Okay. That parent piece is hard to miss, right? I mean, and I think what was interesting pre-pandemic, like the NAACP, some local chapters were doing work on this and so forth. It just was not getting a lot of attention, and they were, in some cases at odds with established education interests. And it was kind of an interesting story, but very sort of subsurface. And as you mentioned, like that stuff seems to be getting more visibility. Penny, you've been doing this a long time in different roles. What do you feel is different this time?
Yeah, Delaware, Texas, and Tennessee. And so all different political contexts and size of states, et cetera. There is something different about this time period than before. I think it's even different than if we go back into the early days of NCLB. Like there is a different focus that I think is not, I don't want to say just about, but in some ways just about the number. And it's actually about the practice and why that's the contributing component and kind of the motivation to get to better numbers. So too often, I think what we've done is we've kind of lamented about how low our reading proficiency rates are, how students can't read, and then everyone hand rings and we get very upset. And I'm not talking about anyone in particular, I just mean collectively as a country. And then we don't necessarily move forward. We try the new silver bullet or the next best thing because we're just trying to hit some kind of accountability target. And it is important, but only because we know that accountability target represents actual children in classrooms and the promise and the opportunities that literacy opens for them. What I think is different about now, certainly it was COVID and the parents being able to see the classroom. In Tennessee, we actually rolled out our strategic plan with this focus before the pandemic had started, kind of mistimed a couple months before, ended up being great timing in the long run. But it was because we looked at our data and then we actually mapped that to what happened to students 10, 20, 30 years down the road, not the national portraits, but actual kids in Tennessee, so that we could speak to people realistically and say, in your community, when children are not reading on grade level, this is actually what happens, and just make it much more personal. Because I care about my kids, but I'm going to care about my kids a lot more than anyone else's kids, right? If I'm a parent and you're trying to explain something or talk about that work. And so for us, when we saw that we had 32% reading proficiency in the state, And I won't say it's not a reading test, but you have to be able to read to be proficient on that ELA test. And so if you have 32% proficiency, that is a whole lot of students who are not where they need to be. And the highest performing states in our country are still a coin flip. And so 50% is actually not something that we should be really proud of either. We must have a higher standard and believe that's possible. From the political perspective, I think where we've seen a lot more stress in the system is related to, once you get down into implementation, which instructional materials do you use and what content is in those instructional materials? How do you think about which books students should be reading? And while this is probably an unpopular opinion, if we are arguing about the text students should read and not whether they should be able to read the text and how to teach them those texts, we've actually made a move forward. And so while I don't necessarily love engaging in those conversations, what I end up talking with folks about is, well, what are the ways in which you can adapt certain materials for your local community and your local belief systems, or things that are really important to your families and parents and teachers and everyone else? And how do we ensure that kids are still reading X number of words or books or minutes every day? And so that is just a very, very different approach than trying to say why we should focus on literacy at all. I want to talk about the how and get into the kind of the meat and the real ugliness of implementation, because that's where the really good work, and that means people have actually invested in making changes that are better for kids. And so I am probably not of the popular opinion there, but I want kids reading as much as possible, and I want them reading on grade level. And when people are all in on that, everyone, I've never met a legislator who's not on board with that. It's just making sure you talk to people in a way in which they can relate to the content, relate to the solution, and feel like they are empowered to be active in getting to what everybody wants, which is 100% proficiency. I've never met an elected official who wants anything different, no matter the state. That is a universal goal that people have.
All right, Beth, you're going to get the last word. And I think that's like very appropriate because you're out there on the front lines. Like, talk about, like, as you're implementing this, we've danced around a little bit, but very specific. What is, you've got, you got an audience here. There'll be a lot of policymakers and folks like that. What do you need? And not just, I'm talking North Carolina, I know you talk to your colleagues in other districts and so forth. What do we need so that this isn't one of these things we look back on, it was a great moment, and then there was, the retrenchment, but that actually this was a pivot and we went in a different direction?
I think we need for folks to be able to create the conditions for commitment, not compliance, and to support districts in doing the right work that is going to change the lives of students.
Brief but important. I appreciate that. Okay, well, the report again is online, and so you can see sort of our take. Some of it is just the factual history of how we got here, but then how, like, lessons from other reform initiatives. I encourage you to read that. Interact with us about it, reach out or on social media and so forth. And this is virtual, but a big virtual thank you to Penny, Barbara, and Beth for just, really interesting insights getting into this. We covered a lot of ground in just an hour, and we're very grateful to you all for that. And more importantly, for the work that all three of you are out there doing to actually move the ball forward on this. So thank you so much for being with us.